Hey, good morning again. We are on Pei Ches Amud Beis. We are going to finish probably one of the more challenging prakim of the Masechta. It's been a hard one. I'll put it out there. Let's be honest. No, we're almost there. Okay, so here we go. So 88b3. Let's finish today. Okay, and then we'll start the new parak. Okay, so v'chein shnei diotos zo keneged zo. You have two upper stories. You have two balconies, which are opposite one another, and they are both over a small courtyard. Okay, and one of the balconies made a cesspool. So imagine you have a scenario where you have two balconies, and one of them makes a cesspool next to their balcony. I'm saying that deliberately. We'll come back to why that's the case. But basically, two balconies. One of them makes a cesspool. Okay, so there's a cesspool next to balcony number one. There's not a cesspool next to balcony number two. And the Mishnah, there's a quote from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that the one that made the cesspool is allowed to pour water into the courtyard. The one who did not make a cesspool is not allowed to pour water into the courtyard / cesspool. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rava. Rava comes along and explains, Afilu ervu. This is true when the Mishnah said that if two upper stories, both they're over a courtyard, one of them made a cesspool, only the person who made the cesspool is allowed to use the cesspool and pour water into the courtyard. Why? Afilu ervu. Even if they both made an eruv, then still only the one who made the cesspool is allowed to use the cesspool. Yeah? You with me? Okay. So the Gemara says, 88b4, Amar Abai says, my timer. What's the reason for that? If you want to say because there's too much water, meaning once you have two people, then the cesspool is going to overflow. Right? In other words, if you have one person, then presumably there's enough there for the cesspool. If there's two people pouring in, then there's going to be too much, and then the water that gets poured into the cesspool is going to overflow and go into the Rishus Harabim. Vatanya, but that can't be the case because it was taught in a brisa. Achas li uka, v'achas li gistra, brecha v'areva. Whether there is a cesspool or some vessel or a fish pond or a small boat. In other words, something that is there, whether a formal structure or some informal structure that is there to catch the sewage. Afal pishnis malamayim erev Shabbos, even though it's full of water before Shabbos, shofchan l'socha mayim b'Shabbos, you're allowed to pour water into it on Shabbos. Why? Because one of the reasons, I mean, we've touched upon it, a bunch of different reasons, but one of the main reasons that you're not allowed to pour water, that you would not be allowed to pour water into a courtyard is because there's a concern that a person may get confused and think, in as much as I'm allowed to pour water into a courtyard and allow the water to flow out into the public domain, I may think I'm allowed to go and just pour water directly into the public domain, which is certainly not allowed. Then I'm pouring from private domain to public domain. I am allowed to pour into the private domain. Midaraisa, I'm allowed to pour into the private domain. In other words, midaraisa, I can go outside on Shabbos without and just pour stuff into my private domain and allow it to flow over, to overflow. I don't know this word. Whatever, fine. I don't know. Go from my private domain into the public domain. Okay, that's fine. The problem is I may get confused and think, I can just go straight into the public domain, right? And so therefore they say you have to pour into some structure, into a cesspool. Now, even if the cesspool is full, it doesn't matter. It's not about pouring into the cesspool. It's just a reminder, I'm not pouring directly into the public domain. So that's what the Brisa says. The Brisa says that once I have a cesspool, even if the cesspool is full, even if it got clogged, whatever, I don't know, it's full, I'm allowed to pour water into it. So Abai is asking, Rava, I don't understand. If you're telling me the reason that, again, you have two people, one of them made a cesspool, one of them did not make a cesspool. So Rava says, only the one who made the cesspool is allowed to pour water in. Abai says, why can't the other person pour in water? Who cares? And you're telling me the reason is because maybe person number one who built it is going to fill it up to the top? Who cares? As long as you're pouring it into a cesspool, even if it's already full, it's still mutter. It should be mutter.
But it goes against the first part that you just said. The whole point is that you're pouring it into something else. If that was established to pour into your own place, not to pour into somebody else's.
But the point is, no. Abai says no. Abai says, and we're going to see no one's pushing. Well, maybe Rava would disagree, but Abai says at the end of the day, it's more of a psychological thing. Like as long as I'm actively not pouring into the Rishus, or as long as I'm pouring into something which in theory could hold on to water, then that's fine. That's enough of a reminder. I can't pour directly into the public domain. So that's going to be true whether I own it, whether I don't. Exactly. So Eli Yitzmar Hachi Yitzmar. So rather, Abaye says that really we misunderstood Rava. Rava was misquoted. Rather, Rava said as follows: Amar Rava 89a1 Lo Shanu El Shlo Eruv. It's specifically when they did not make an eruv. Aval eruvu mitarim. But when they made an eruv, it's mutter. Okay. Ask the Gemara v'chile eruvu my time alo. When they did not make an eruv, why can't you pour water into the neighbor's cesspool? Okay. Amar Ravashi Gezerah. There's a decree. Dama asla puke mimani devatim lahasim. Because maybe I'm going to carry my my utensils to the cesspool. In other words, like this. Rava is saying, and the way we're understanding Rava is as follows. The way we're understanding the end of the Mishnah is as follows. We have two balconies, balcony 1, balcony 2. One of them made a cesspool over here. There's no Eruv. So this person over here, he's allowed to pour his water into it, even though there's no Eruv over here, but I'm just pouring my water. I'm just pouring the water into the cesspool. That's going to be allowed. This person technically should be allowed, should be allowed to pour. The problem is, the reason that he's not allowed to pour is because there's a concern. Since there's a distance over here, he may not just pour water. He may go ahead and leave his house carrying one of his buckets and pour water into there. That already is going to be problematic if there's no Eruv over here. Now let's just pour direct, pour from the porch, like the sponge or whatever it's going to be. That would be fine. And technically, if this person can make the shot, that would be okay. The reason it's not allowed is because this one made it. It's not so much that he made it versus this one didn't make it. Making it implies that it's next to his courtyard, next to his porch. That's why he's allowed to pour it over here. This person can't do it because we're concerned that he may go ahead and carry stuff.
So it's not about cesspool or anything.
It's more about distance. It's more about distance. Exactly. Okay, we finished. The 8th parak we are going to begin. The 9th, the second to last parak of Maseches Eruvin. Here we go. A lot easier. Trust me. I mean, don't trust me, but we'll see it together. Okay. Kol gagos echas. All the adjoining roofs of one town are one domain. Okay, what that means is as follows. You have cities back in the day, everyone had flat roofs, like Ner Tamid. Ner Tamid is a throwback to the past. I don't know why in the world we have a flat roof, but we do. And basically that was the norm. Back in the day, everyone had flat roofs. Wait, I don't know, all the houses around here are built in 1959. I don't know, my house was built in like 1902. It has a normal thing. Okay, anyway, whatever. What's it called? The point is that all the homes have flat roofs, okay? And they're all considered one domain, according to the Tanakama, according to Rameir, okay? Uvilvad, meaning that what that means is that on Shabbos, a person will be allowed to carry from one roof to another, even if they did not make an Eruv, right? So imagine a person is going from one roof to another, a little like Newsy style, right? They're like jumping from one roof to the other. They are allowed to carry things, even if there's no Eruv whatsoever. Fine? Okay? Uvilvad shle'yegag gavoa sara o namach sara. As long as they are all within 10 tvachim of one another. But if you have one taller home that's taller than 10 tvachim, and then the other one's lower, etc., then we treat them as separate places. The Gemara is going to ask, why does that make any difference? No, you're going to count it from where you're standing. In other words, that's already a domain on its own. You don't call him a makom patur. You will not call him a makom patur if it's above 10. Yeah, but that's if you're standing over here and there's something in this domain above 10, you would treat it as this. We don't treat every roof by definition as makom patur. Also, makom patur is going to have to be less than 4 wide. This is going to be larger than 4 wide.
But if you're in a place where you've got these row homes,
yeah, but they're definitely more than four tvachim. I'm saying that's tiny. I mean, you can't have a house like that. That's like small homes, a whole different degree. Okay. Again, as long as one roof is not 10 tvachim high or low. These are the words of Rameir. Each roof is a domain onto its own. Okay? The Chacham disagree and they say, no, you cannot carry from one roof to another. Okay? So if all our roofs were connected one to another, the Chacham say, I could go onto my own roof, it would seem, but I can't go from my roof to your roof unless there's an Eruv. Rav Shimon Omer, echad gagos ve'echad chatziros ve'echad karpefos v'shus achas hein lekelim sheshavs l'sochan. Rav Shimon comes along and says something different. He says that any time you have these different types of private domains, meaning a roof, a chatzir, a karpaf, they're all going to be considered one domain regarding utensils that reside in them on Shabbos. We saw this quoted numerous times over the Masechta. V'lo lechem shavsu v'socha bais, as opposed to utensils against Shabbos in the house. Okay, so Rav Shimon comes along and says something different. And this is, Rav Shimon says, again, Chachamim and Rameir are arguing about what is the status of going from one roof to another roof. Rameir says all roofs are one. The Chachamim say no, each roof is its own domain. Okay? Rav Shimon says anything that is outside, again, not in Rishus Rabbim, anything that's outside in any form of these, a chatzir, a karpef, whatever, that you're allowed to bring it from one of those places to another. There's no problem. We're going to analyze it a little bit more later. But as opposed to if something was in my house, which is a much more of a private domain, right? It's enclosed, then I can't go from my private domain into one of those places. Okay? We'll do the whys soon. Okay? Meaning the why. Okay? fine. Let's go. The Gemara is going to analyze these different opinions. Yosef Abaye bar Avin, Rav Chanina bar Avin, Yosef Abaye Gabayo. Abaye bar Avin, Rav Chanina bar Avin were sitting, and Abaye was sitting next to them. Yosef Amri, and they, Abaye bar Avin and Rav Chanina bar Avin, were discussing our Mishnah, and they said as follows: Bishlam the Rabbanan. They understand the Rabbanan why Sabri Kishem Shediyorn Chalukin Lamata, Kach Diyorn Chalukin Lamala. The Rabbanan's Shita, their opinion is very understandable. It's very easy to understand. You have different roofs, you have different homes. Each home is considered its own place, just like inside is its own place. So also outside on the top, it's going to be its own place, even though they're adjoining one another, but they're their own place. So we understand the Chacham why they say, I can't go from my roof to your roof, even if these are two roofs and they're side by side. At the end of the day, since underneath this is one domain, and underneath that is a separate domain, just because they're open one to another, why would I be allowed? It makes sense. We understand where the Rabbanan say, I can't go from this roof to that roof. That makes sense, okay? Ella Rameir, Mike Savar. What does Rameir hold? If he holds that they're separate, okay, that they're fully separate, then amai arshus achas hein. Then why does he hold you allowed to go from one roof to another? Vikas avar ein chalukin, and if he holds they are not separate, dechol amala me'asar arshus achasi, because he holds that as long as something is above 10 tefachim, we treat it as one domain. In other words, that would be the rationale of Rameir. He says, granted, in a regular domain, if it's 2 courtyards, of course Rameir holds I can't go from my courtyard to your courtyard. But once it's high, meaning it's a roof to a roof, then we treat it all as just like one continuous domain. Maybe that's his opinion. Then then he should also say it's problematic. Then he should also allow, then why does he differentiate between when the roofs are not the same height? Right? He says if one roof is high and one roof is low, you can no longer do it. Why is that a problem? In other words, if Rameir holds, I'm allowed to go that anything above 10 tefachim is one continuous rishus, even though we know underneath it's your home and it's my home and it's this home and it's that home, doesn't matter. Since it's above 10 tefachim, it's all one rishus. So then who cares if one is a little bit higher and one is a little bit lower? At the end of the day, they're all above 10 tefachim. They're all roofs of homes, right? So why can't I just go from one to the other? You with me? Yeah, it's straightforward question. 8984. Didn't you hear that which Rav Yitzchak bar Abdimi said? Omer hayr Rameir. Rameir would say, any situation we're going to find 2 domains that are one domain, okay? Meaning, there are 2 areas that are separated by a height of 10 tvachim, even though they're really a single domain. They're both full-fledged Rishus HaYachid. Kigon, for example, Amud Rishus HaYachid Gvos Rav Rachav Arba. If it is a post in Rishus HaYachid that is 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide. In other words, here we are now in the private domain. You're in a private domain, and you have something which looks like that. Okay, so we're in a private domain, and you have something like that. Okay, which is private. We're in the private domain. There is something like this beam over here. Sorry for those there. That's the bima. Okay. You're not allowed to place things on it. Why? Because if that was in the public domain, if that same bima was in the public domain, and we're walking in the public domain, I would not be allowed to take something and put it on it and take it back down. Why? Because that is a Rishus HaYachid. That is a Rishus HaYachid. Why? Because it is 10 tefachim high, 10 tefachim high, and it's 4 across, and therefore it's a private domain. If that same structure, that same bima was sitting in the public domain, that would be a private domain in a public domain. Okay, and therefore, Rameir holds that I'm not allowed, it's not because, really Rameir holds that anything above 10 tefachim is indeed one domain. And really, technically, there should, midoraisa, I should have no problem going from my roof to your roof to this roof to that roof, because they're all above 10 tefachim, and therefore one domain. There is a separate decree when something is 10 tefachim high, then even if it's the same domain, there's a concern of mixing it up with a public domain where you have something of that height, and therefore, there's a decree because of that you shouldn't put things on it. Now, the poskim will ask, wait a second, what about, how does your mayor have Kriyas HaTorah? Okay, literally they asked this question, right? I'm using this example deliberately. In other words, okay, so according to your mayor, I can never, so if you put something on a table, okay, no problem. The table's probably, this is under 10 tvachim, no problem, right? But let's say you go ahead and you, according to your mayor, he just said, anytime you're in one domain, a private domain, and you take something and you put it on you go from one space in a private domain to another when it's 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide, i.e. a bima, it's asur. So what does Kriyas HaTorah look like? You're a Meir Shul. It's a Sephardi Shul. Still going to be problematic. Holding it this way, but they're still putting it down. Small table. Okay, fine. They're a Sephardi Shul. They probably were a Sephardi Shul. Okay, we're probably the ones who made it up. But, the Torah says we have it. Probably. I have no idea. But okay. Okay, fair answer. Small table. So the poskim say that maybe a mayor only says this idea when it's open space. In other words, private domain in the open space, but something like this where it's enclosed, your mayor's not going to take his decree that far. Which makes sense. The whole thing is confusing it with a public domain. This is so obviously a private domain. Okay, let's go a little further.
The Chachamim are just saying, to differentiate from this, that each place is its own.
Each place is its own, which makes right.
Which means you
Cannot. Correct.
And then Reb Shimon is.
We'll come back to Rosh Shimon. Rameir and the Chum are arguing most directly. They hold, Rameir holds that all above 10 Tvachim is one space, and he holds this decree, this external decree, and the Chum say, no, each home, this is my home, so it's a private, different space than that home. Okay, so fine. Hachinami gzer mishum tel b'shus ram. So Bai says here too, the reason the Rameir does not allow going from one roof to another when there's a 10 tefach gap, 10 tefach height difference between one and the other, is because of this concern of an elevation in the Rishus Rabbim. Okay, says the Gemara, Savar mina afilu machteshes afilu gigis. Abai bar Avin and Rechina bar Avin understood the Rameir's ban of going within a private domain from the floor to something above would be true for even movable objects, even a mortar or a barrel. In other words, they thought initially that a mayor would not allow things from in a private, even in one domain, if the item itself, even if it was a movable item, as opposed to something which is really set in place. He says, no, this is what we learned. Lo Amar Rameir Ella Amud Yo I. Rameir only said his halacha with either a post or a base of a millstone, something which is very stuck there. In other words, not something which is going to be movable. Since a person assigns these objects a set place, meaning something which is typically stationary, like a bima, like as opposed to if let's say you have a very big barrel, but the barrel is going to be moved around all the time. There, Abaye did not take his decree that far. In other words, his decree is only so in a place where something is typically set, but when something is moved around, Abaye's decree, Rameir's decree does not apply. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara further. Ask the Gemara on Rameir's approach. There is, let's talk about a case of a wall between two courtyards. Now, you have two courtyards side by side and a wall between them. Okay, the wall is pretty much set. It's a wall. It's built into the ground, right? And what is the, and Amar Rav Yehuda, and Rav Yehuda said, Kishatim Tzalomar, when you analyze things, you'll see, L'divrei Rameir, according to Rameir, Gagin Rishus La'atzman, that roofs are a domain unto themselves. Okay, we know what that means. That means, according to Rameir, if I go from one roof to another roof, it's permitted. That statement makes sense. Then he says, Chatzeros Rishus La'atzman, courtyards are a domain to another. Karpefos Rishus La'atzman, and karpavs are a very large space. They are a domain onto their own. Okay, so the Gemara, let's go to the words, courtyards are a domain onto their own, meaning I'm allowed to carry from one courtyard to another, according to Rameir. In other words, Rav Yehuda the Amora is saying, based on our Mishnah, in as much as Rameir permitted going from this rooftop to that rooftop, he also allows going from one courtyard to another courtyard. Okay, so the Gemara says, wait a second. My love to derech kosel. Doesn't that mean, how do I go from one courtyard to another courtyard? Doesn't mean I'm climbing over the roof, over the wall, and I go from courtyard over here, wall over here, courtyard over here. According to Rameir, according to Rav Yehuda said, Rameir would allow you to go from this courtyard into this courtyard. How do I get there? Don't I scale the roof, scale the wall, and then go down? Now the wall is above 10 Tvachim. And what's happening according to this is that Rameir is permitting, according to what Rav Yehuda just said, is that I'm going ahead and going from my courtyard above 10 Tvachim and then down. Didn't you just say that Rameir has this decree that I'm afraid that something which is above 10 Tvachim is going to be problematic because I'm going to confuse it when it's in a in a public domain? Now, according to Rav Yehuda's statements, it would seem that Rameir is not concerned about going from the floor to something above 10 Tvachim. That's the Gemara's question.
Can he allow you to go from one courtyard to another if there isn't a wall?
For sure he would allow that. The question is, meaning that's not problematic to our discussion. In other words, Rameir certainly is going to allow you going from one courtyard to another. But Rav Yehuda is saying, but the assumption is that when Rav Yehuda said Rameir allows you to go from courtyard to courtyard, you're going from the courtyard, you're scaling the wall, and then you're going down, which is above 10 Tvachim. And we just said, Abaye just said, that the whole thing is this decree, etc., etc. So the Gemara says, my love to Charlotte doesn't mean he's going to scale the wall. So Rav Huna, Bar Yehuda, Rav Shesha, Bar Rav Yehuda, Rav Shesha, lo, lachlis lo tzederech pesachim. No. Who says that you're scaling a wall? Maybe you're a normal person. There's a door in the wall. And therefore, Rameir never said that you could go, when Rav Yehuda said that according to Rameir, you could go from one courtyard to another, he was never saying go from courtyard, go up the wall, i.e. above 10 Tvachim, and then down. All he allowed was to go from one courtyard to another through the door, and therefore it's not a question on our position that Rameir makes this decree about the 10 Tvachim high, and that discussion is rested. Now we come back to the Machlokas.
He still allows you to go even without an Eruv?
It would seem without an Eruv. It would seem without an Eruv. Correct. And the focus is as long as it's not going to go above 10 Tvachim. Correct. Okay. So now, because they're both, again, keep in mind, they're both private domains. They're both, and therefore, okay.
Does it make any difference if the wall is owned by somebody or
Not in this respect, no. Not in this respect. Okay, so one more. Let's go back. One more piece we're going to discuss, and that is again, Chachamim say you're not allowed to go from one roof to another, and Rameir says you could go from one roof to another. Okay, the Gemara is going to discuss what's the nature of these roofs. Or in other words, you have some places where the roofs are like this. Okay, you have this is my house, this is your roof, right? Like in every movie, like the person like jumps over, dramatically and jumps over and falls over here, and then you have scenarios where they're all attached, right? If you're like, the back tables over there, right, where you all are sitting, imagine those tables are rooftops and they're all adjacent one to another, right? So those are the two models of roofs that we're going to be differentiating between, okay? So the okay, so the Chacham say that each roof is domain unto its own. Itmar. Rav said that on each roof you're only allowed to carry, according to the Chachamim, who said you can't go from one roof to another, you're only allowed to carry within 4 amos on the roof. In other words, according to the Chachamim, if my roof, the two roofs there's roofs up, there's roofs, and according to the Chachamim, when I go onto my own roof, on Shabbos, if there's no Eruv, I'm only allowed to move things within 8 feet, i.e. 4 amos, but I don't have my whole roof to use. Okay? Shmuel Amar that mutzal tal tbekulo. Shmuel says I'm allowed to carry on under my whole roof.
Did we already establish that you have to have something around the perimeter of it, just like we said with the post, it would be the same.
Just the same as what?
The same as the porch. It has to be a certain height. So you have to have something around your roof.
Where did we establish?
Safe to be on.
Forget the safety. Forget the safety.
It should be enclosed in one place.
Forget the safety. Maybe they should have, maybe they shouldn't have. Doesn't matter. Bottom line is they didn't. There's no surrounding wall. That's the case. There's no surrounding wall, and so you have a scenario where you have. So again, we have machlokas. Rav and Shmuel are arguing when I go to my roof. The Chachamim say I can't go from my roof to your roof. Everyone agrees. But on my roof, am I allowed to carry fully all over my roof? Shmuel says yes. Rav says, no, I'm only allowed to carry within 4 amos. I can't really carry. I'm only allowed to move things a little bit, but I'm not allowed to carry freely through my own roof. Okay? That's Rav and that's Shmuel. Says the Gemara, when the roofs are separated by walls that are visible, everyone agrees, okay? Meaning like this. In this scenario where my roof is over here and your roof is over here, but they're totally separate, I see the ends of my wall, right? Then everyone agrees I'm allowed to carry within my own roof. Why? Because we have this concept, and here we're going to get into our virtual walls discussion. Not as complicated as last time, don't worry. But basically, when I'm standing on this roof, it's because I see the edges, then halachically it's as if there is a wall that goes up. Okay? And therefore, I don't have an Eruv, therefore, according to the Chachamim, I can't carry from my roof to your roof, but it's as if there's a wall around my roof, and therefore, everyone agrees I'm allowed to carry freely on my roof. In other words, if you go to your, if you had a flat roof, okay, and there's no Eruv, everyone would agree, our homes are separate, then everyone would, if your home is separate, then everyone would agree that you are allowed to carry on your whole roof because this edge of the wall is as if there are walls, the edge of the roof is as if there are walls that go up. You with me? Yeah? Ushmuel Amar, keep ligi, when they argue, when the walls are not visible. Okay, meaning, what does it mean the walls are not visible? Like the back tables where you are all sitting in the back over there, that the roofs are adjacent side by side. There's no meaning, if you're standing on the roof, you would not be able to tell the difference as to where one person's property begins and one property ends. Rav Amar Amos. Rav says, you are only allowed to carry within 4 amos, Amar good asik mechitzta. You do not say that a roof goes up if it's immediately flush with another roof. Right? In other words, if this is your bird's eye view of the roofs, is that they're like this. And, granted, I know where one property ends, one property doesn't. But since there's no real gap between them, right? If there's a gap between them, then basically we see, it's as if there's like imaginary walls going up, and therefore it's all surrounded. Ooh, that's good, 3-dimensional. Okay. But if they are like this, right? That's when they argue. Rav says, since even though you know where one ends, but since there's no gap, there's no space over here, we don't see the virtual walls. And Shmuel says, no. Since I know where one roof ends and one roof doesn't, then we do create those virtual walls, and that's why Shmuel.
Because you can't see the wall, the roof's over the top of it, right?
Oh yeah, you don't see the wall. Even though I know my property ends, mine is this one's red, this one's blue, right? Everyone has their own, whatever. You know there's really a distinction. You know this is where my property ends. But since you don't see the real edge, since they're all flush, Rav says, well, you can't do this whole virtual wall thing since I don't see the edges. Whereas Shmuel says, no, I know it ends over here. I see it ends over here. Just because it's flush, I'm still allowed to, according to Shmuel, I'd still be allowed to make those virtual walls. And let's just read that inside. You don't extend the partitions when it's covered, when it's just side by side and adjacent. Shmuel says you're allowed to carry on the entire roof. Why? Because you extend the walls and the partitions, even though they're covered, even though they're exactly side by side and flush to one another, nonetheless, you know that they're separated. You know underneath there's a wall over here. In other words, if I were to have like 3D vision, I would see there's a wall going down, right? And therefore I know there's a wall, and therefore the wall continues going up, and therefore Shmuel allows me to carry throughout the entire thing. Have a great day.